Hello, and welcome to another edition of Billboard Comics. My name is Bill, and here's another installment of our Crossroads of Comic Books and History format. It started with an explosion. Boom! And this explosion begat a whole bunch of things. Fires of storm and stars. Locations varying from the Old West to the present day to World War II battlefields. It involved men who were changing, lightnings that were black, and a whole bunch of other kind of goodness coming out of it. However, it was not meant to last. The heavens opened up and dropped a whole bunch of snow onto the world. And then 1 year later, it did it again. And these two instances were almost deadly to the explosion, causing a reverse event, an implosion. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, today on this edition of Crossroads of Comic Books and History, I'm talking about the DC explosion and implosion and how the blizzards of 1977 and 1978 decided to play a part in both those events. Well, mostly the latter, but nonetheless. Let's start off by explaining what the explosion was. It started around 1975. For the longest time, DC Comics was the big dog in the yard, the big kid on a playground. It was the most popular, best-selling, most money-making comic book company in the entire world. Not really had any kind of worry about anything such as, alternate publishers or anything like that to chink its armor. Its lineup of Superman and Batman and Wonder Woman and all the various other heroes in its lineup made it number one with a bullet. And it seemed like it was going to stay there. However, things were not meant to be. A young upstart started in 1961 called Marvel Comics. At first, there wasn't really that much of a challenge to it, but slowly over time, its mix of realism and well-defined characters such as Spider-Man, the Fantastic Four, and Incredible Hulk eventually took over the popularity from DC Comics and went from being like the cool alternative to the mega comic book corporation. It became the top dog. By the time 1975 rolled around, Marvel was pretty much on top of the world. Spider-Man was a household name, hopefully in part by his appearing on a semi-regular basis on the educational program Electric Company. Incredible Hulk was also had talks about having a TV show in the works, which would come in 1977, a couple of years later. And in the comic book front, the comic books were experiencing a rise in popularity due to an upstart team book, The X-Men, which a year or two prior was on the brink of cancellation, but now slowly building up to become one of Marvel's most popular comic books and one of the most popular comic books in comic book history. DC was worried, and DC had come up with a plan to combat this. Their plan to combat this was to basically try to choke Marvel Comics out of the newsstand. And they did this by publishing more and more titles into its line of comic books. I do not know the logic behind this. It seems to kind of if the Marvel Comics are selling good, why would anybody on a newsstand want to give up shelf space to DC Comics and their new number ones, which are unproven concepts? But this is what DC did. DC, from 1975 to 1978, published over 50 books, and they weren't all new number ones. They published a whole bunch of number ones. That's to be said. Legendary titles such as DC Comics Presents and Jonah Hex got his own comic book. Firestorm, Starfire. The first issue special was one of the first ones to come out of the gate in January of 1975. a concept that kind of like was every issue was a first issue. It did have some success coming out of it. It generated Warlord #1 coming out of it, but also generated a new start for a old title that was canceled several years before, The New Gods. There's a number of titles that were canceled from 3, 4, 5, even 7 years prior. They're brought back as part of the DC explosion. Among them, Challenge to the Unknown with #81, Metal Men, Mr. Miracle, The New Gods, started with the title called Return of New Gods with #14, Showcase, a number of other ones. Most importantly, also All-Star Comics, a comic book that left the stands back in like 1940s, 1950s, with issue number 57, was back with a brand new team of Golden Age heroes taking place in modern day. It's notable for number 58 is notable for actually introducing a new character into DC Comics continuity, Power Girl. Power Girl was the Earth 2 answer to Supergirl, Superman's cousin, and is still popular to this very day. And we all know why. Now, this is going on a good clip, and it did have they let DC have an opportunity to actually kind of push its boundaries a little bit. Marvel was still cooler and hipper and had its more interesting concepts, but during the time of DC Explosion, we got our first African American hero from DC Comics, Black Lightning. If the line continued, we've got our first female African American hero in Vixen coming out. That was canceled due to part of the implosion, which I'll get to in a little bit. We got, like I said, Jonas Hex finally getting his own title. We had TV tie-ins from ISIS and Super Friends and Mr. Welcome Back Kotter. We had war books. We had westerns. We had all kinds of books. DC was just throwing everything on the wall and see if it stuck, just to try to get some market share away from Marvel. Would they have their plans of doing this was kind of curtailed due to Mother Nature. In 1977 and 1978, there were two major blizzards. 1977 was a blizzard that went across most of the United States. It had, before it was done, in some areas, it left over 100 inches of snow on the ground. That's over 8 feet. That's taller than any human being. On top of that, they had wind gusts up to 69 miles per hour, which kind of not really helped with the whole shoveling effort, because if you have gusts that strong, as soon as you get done shoveling a walkway or a highway or whatever, it usually gets covered up by snow because of the gusts. It ended up with 25 related storm related deaths over its tenure, which lasted from January 28th, 1977 to February 1st, 1977. Almost a year to the day later, give or take a week, there was the blizzard 1978. This took place from February 5th, 1978 to February 7th, 1978. It had a high, some locations had a high of 27.6 inches, and even though it was a kind of not as much snowfall, it was much more deadly. The storm ended up with 100 people dead and injuring 4,500 of them. It estimated cost more than $520 million in damages. For those of you who don't live in the Northeast, I live in the Northeast, and you might not be the topic of the things of snow might be a total foreign concept to you. When you get a little dusting, it becomes a cause of celebration and excitement for you. However, when you have snow, there's regular snow, and you can actually deal with it. Blizzard conditions such as these, things just completely shut down. You cannot move, you cannot do anything, you just shelter in space, and this is why most times when there's snow in the Northeast and the northern states, when the snow's coming, there's a run on bread and milk, and usual essential items for food and stuff like this, because it could be a regular, not as bad as they say it is, but if it's worse than they say it is, you need to actually hunker down and like stay inside and just try to actually, you know, like make sure you have provisions until you're able to actually come out of your hole and see the sunlight again. But these had a kind of daunting effect on the world of comic books. Basically, these, like both these blizzards, shut down pretty much most of the eastern seaboard. And if you know anything about comic books, that's where most of the production and the printing and everything from comic books are done. Some are done in Canada. If you're not allowed on the roads, you cannot deliver your books. You cannot have them printed. You can't have them delivered to your newsstands or markets or anything like that. This delayed a lot of the books coming to market, and it resulted in, from what I understand, a lot of returns of these books. This is back when the newsstand market was the main method of selling these things. There's still comic book stores around, but it's still in their infancy. Most of them are like sent to like supermarkets and newsstands and bookstores and all kinds of stuff like that, who would return the unsold kind of comic books to the publisher. Being that some of these weren't able to be delivered at all, DC got a lot of returns for both these blizzards. Now, this affected their bottom line. It wasn't just the blizzards, though, however. I have to be honest with you. There's a lot of things going on there. In 1978, there's a rampant inflation in the country. And as I'm saying this, we have a case of rampant inflation going up right now. That means prices of everything are going up. Not just the stuff that consumers buy, but also to printing presses, the cost of paper they used to make the comic books, the cost of delivering them. As such, since the DC was publishing so much titles, it became a draw on their financial resources, and the parent company, Warner Brothers at the time, decided to say, listen, enough. We need to do a purge of these comic books. And that purge was referred to cheekily as the DC implosion. It's, a play, explosion, implosion, explosion, implosion. Witty, those people are. But this was kind of a red wedding kind of calling of titles. There were at least 20 of the titles that were canceled, either just outright because of the whole DC implosion effort, or some came in were originally planned for a natural end, but they never got a new series or any series to replace that. Not every book was in danger. There's a number of books that went on to a long life after the DC implosion. DC Comics Presents is one of them. That was the Superman team-up book. It got its start right before the culling started, but it went on to last for 97 issues. Went to about 1985, 1986, somewhere around that time period. John Hex went on for 92 issues. Amazingly, considering how it's a sword and sorcery kind of book, Warlord managed to go on for 130 issues, well into the 1980s. So not everything was culled, but a lot of them were. And it came at such a point that it was brought in by such a point that there are comic books in the can already, ready to be put out, ready to be published, ready to be colored and sent out to stuff like this, that were just nipped in the bud, died on the vine. They're completely written, completely drawn, and stories that would never have seen the light of day. Well, not exactly. But the idea was between this is like that the Warners forced DC to majorly cut back all this on the book, stuff like this. Every lower kind of selling book was on the market. It was on the chopping blocks, so to speak. It involved every book. Nothing was sacrosanct. One of the ones that Warner recommended DC canceling was Detective Comics. Detective Comics was one. What I guess it was one of the lowest selling Batman books. It was definitely being outpaced by the DC Explosion Batman Family book that made its debut, I believe, in 1975 or 1976. Warner Bros. Saw the bottom line, saw the numbers on this, say like, okay, cancel Detective Comics, leave this going. One problem is that the bean counters at Warner's didn't realize that why would you cancel the comic book that the entire company was named after? Most people know this by now. I'm sure a lot of this is going to be old news to everybody out there. But in case you don't know, DC Comics, the DC in DC Comics stands for Detective Comics. Yes, whenever you say DC Comics, you're really saying Detective Comics. It was one of the earliest books that DC Comics, back when its national periodical publications, ever published. Home to the first appearance of Batman, the second major hero from DC Comics. It was historically important, but to the bean counters and Warners who didn't know anything about this, it was on a chopping block. Eventually, wiser minds prevailed, and they decided to actually kind of meld, for a brief period of time, the Batman Family concept, which was an anthology which featured a number of different kind of stories in one, featuring Bat Family members, into one oversized comic book, into the Detective Comics. So Detective Comics kind of became Detective Comics featuring the Batman family. It was like the marketing was very the Indica actually said that and kind of stuff like this. So it's kind of like kind of like trying to play on the people who actually liked the Batman Family book better than Detective Comics to think it is the Batman Family, and not realize on tiny little script above the Batman Family logo, Detective Comics presenting the Batman Family. However, of course, like, did people really like the Batman Family more than Detective Comics? I don't know. I like I said back then, I was like 4 years old when this happened, so I wasn't really up on the whole comic book market. And at the time, it was it probably kept it close to the chest how much money they were making on these comic books. It's not like it was in the 80s and 90s where that information was freely available. However, Batman Family was in a dollar special book. It was a oversized book that had numerous stories in it, so it had a higher price. I think it was like $1 book, where most of the other books were like 25 cents. So for every copy of Batman Family that was sold, it made 4 times as much as a copy of Detective Comics. It might have sold just as much or just as little as Detective Comics, but because the price point was so much higher, it made more money. But just because of that blizzard and all the financial hit from the actual returns that happened because of it, Detective Comics almost didn't make it. In addition to all the cancellations, there was a number of books that were in the pipeline, some of historical import that were never got a chance to see the light of day. There are books like, say, like Battle Classics #1 and Dynamic Classics #1 and Army at War #1, both anthologies, oversized anthology books that were able to get one issue out before the actual implosion happened. Some didn't even get that lucky. There are books such as the aforementioned Vixen. Vixen was being played up, made a first appearance, I believe, in an Action Comics issue, and was starting to make cameo appearances across the DC universe with the idea of eventually her getting her own book. That kind of failed. Also, the implosion kind of like was indirectly responsible for the creation of Continuity Comics. There were 2 comic books that were originally planned for the DC line that eventually became part of Continuity Comics. One was Ms. Mystic. It was a Neil Adams concept using Mike Netzer. I guess it's about a mystic woman. That was supposed to be a DC comic, but since it was canceled by DC Comics, Neil Adams went on to Pacific, and they published a series of it. And then when that series was over, he published it on his own company, Continuity. Another major continuity publication that was supposed to be part of the DC Comics lineup was Bucky O'Hare. Bucky O'Hare was created by Larry Hama and I believe Michael Golden, if I'm not mistaken, and it's about a spacefaring rabbit. Some people who might not know comics might know that character because he actually had a life outside of comic books. He had a cartoon series. It had a successful Nintendo Entertainment System video game. It had a line of action figures. I wonder if DC Comics ever kicks himself by letting that go. That found a home in Continuity Comics, and I don't know if it is owned by Larry Hama and Michael Golden or owned by Continuity, but whoever, they probably got a pretty penny of whatever money that made that would have went into DC Comics pockets because they were just really impatient about the whole snow thing and the hits that it was taken to their bottom line. Comic books that were made that were already in the can and never got a chance to see the light of day were collected. They were collected into two legendary. It's a legendary kind of underground kind of comic book stuff called the Canceled Comics Cavalcade. This is a kind of a very kind of weird, down to earth kind of comic book that is incredibly rare. There's only 35 copies of each of these comic books that were made. They weren't actually made as regular comic books. They took all the artwork and the storylines and mimeographed them into like photocopied things, stapled them together. These books were never up for sale, even though it had a $1 sign on it. One copy was sent to the U.S. Copyright Office just to keep a copyright on the stories in case they needed to use them in the future, and the characters in the future. And another one was sent to Overstreet Price Guide just to actually proof of existence of this. Other than that, they kind of basically were given to creators, kept out in the files of DC Comics. Some have made it out, but it's not at all common or anything like that. You could pay hundreds of dollars for a copy of these if you want to online or in stores or conventions, if you could find them. But I've never seen them in my years of collecting. They're kind of very legendary, kind of it's the Sasquatch of comic books, for me personally, on that. A lot of the concepts that were canceled there were eventually reintroduced later on. Certain characters were continued on. Firestorm became a member of the Justice League. He eventually had a backup in Flash Comics, which survived the carnage, and eventually got his own series about 5 years after his original was canceled, called Fury Firestorm, which lasted for over 100 issues. And it's a concept that has been repeated back and back again and again and again. Some of the horror anthologies were melted into other ones, most notably The Unexplained. Basically, if you have a horror story, it could be used in any of DC's horror books, and they had quite a few at the time that were quite popular. Vixen, of course, went on to become part of the Justice League and was on the Justice League cartoon and in the Arrowverse. So she had a life after the whole implosion, even though she did not get her own series until much after that. It was a big kind of extravaganza kind of thing that kind of failed, and I kind of wonder, looking back at it, did it need to fail? If, say, DC Comics head honchos were able to convince listen, give us time, would some of these catch on? Would we still like reading Freedom Fighters to this day? Would we still be seeing the Jack Kirby books, New Gods and Mr. Miracle, be republished again? Would they still be going on today? Would Claw the Unconquered become as big as Conan the Barbarian? Would Starfire become as big as Barbarella? Who knows? We will never know because these were all nipped in the bud before they had a chance to actually get a footing or gain an audience. Starfire, I don't believe has ever been seen before. Claw has been kind of here and there. But this is an interesting intersection of weather, two historic storms in the history of all weather, and comic books. So next time you see snow coming, make sure you get your comic books first and foremost, then go for your bread and your milk. Do you have anything more to add to this story? I did pretty much thorough investigation into this. I just find this as one of the most fascinating issues of history about how like the storm affected like the actual over like is given a lot of blame for the implosion of DC's comics expansion. If I have to be honest with you, do a little tutorial here, I don't think it's really fair. I mean, Marvel had the same problems, the same high costs, the same kind of distribution issues, but they pretty much survived. They didn't really have to do that. I think a lot of it has. I think it's DC's hubris and arrogance in trying to get like to force Marvel out of the market by overloading the shelves with DC product that kind of did them in. But that's it. Do you have anything else to do? Do you remember being alive during this? Maybe older than I am, and see what happened with that. Leave us a request in the comments. If you made it this far, please try to subscribe, like the thing, and share it. Every little bit helps with the algorithm, and I'm trying to grow this as much as possible. I'm going dribs and drabs. I love it's my fault because I'm kind of like I'm very, very shy and I don't like to actually go out and sell this. However, if you could help me out, this would be great. But that's all for this installment of the Crossroads of comic books and history. Until next time, keep on collecting.